Good evening and welcome to People in Politics. My guest tonight is Boyd Coons at the Atlanta Preservation Center. Welcome, Boyd.
Good evening, Chad.
Boyd, what is the Atlanta Preservation Center?
Well, we're the nonprofit entity that's charged with the preservation of Atlanta's historic neighborhoods, landscapes, and buildings.
And when was the Preservation Center formed and why was it formed?
Well, it was formed in 1980. We're 24 years old, so we're coming up on our 25th anniversary next year. It was formed because that was a period when so many of Atlanta's historic treasures and assets were being lost, and there had just been a battle over the Fox Theater. And that was sort of a seminal event that galvanized Atlantans and made them conscious of what we were losing and what we could save.
What was the situation with the Fox Theater?
Well, like so many things before it, the terminal and numerous buildings downtown, numerous neighborhoods, the Fox was threatened. I believe Southern Bell was seeking to put up their headquarters building there. And people in Atlanta had just identified with the Fox, so it was the sort of place where people had gone when they were younger. They had happy events associated with it, and of course it's such a marvelous building that there was a popular response unlike anything that had happened before. People wrote in on their bills, save the Fox, and there was just a public outpouring, and people began to think of what could be done to save the building, and an alternate site was suggested, and Southern Bell cooperated with that, and we had the happy ending that we have today, where we still have that marvelous theater that's about to celebrate its 75th anniversary later on this year.
So that was a grassroots effort, just ordinary people were just writing in or expressing their concern? Was there an organization that took up the cause?
Yes, Landmark Atlanta Landmarks, owns the Fox and administers it today and does a wonderful job. They've been very effective in ways that I think all Atlantans can appreciate, in that they combine the best things that we think of in Atlanta. They are preserving something, which of course we're for, and yet they've done it in a very business-like way. They've made the Fox profitable. And so it's an example of how a preserved building can take on a new life and contribute to the city, not only aesthetically, but economically.
Where's the Atlanta Preservation Center located?
We're in Grant Park, which is, I believe, Atlanta's largest historic district. It's to the southeast of downtown. Most people know where the zoo and the cyclorama are, and that's the Grant Park neighborhood.
How many staff members do you have at the Atlanta Preservation Center?
We have 3 who are there full-time, day-to-day, and I'm very lucky because I just have the most wonderful staff imaginable. And then we have a number of people who come in and help us in other ways, part-time and as volunteers.
The Atlanta Preservation Center is a nonprofit group?
Oh, yes.
Where do they get their funding from?
Well, private contributions through memberships. We do 7 historic walking tours, one of which is the Fox. Landmark Atlanta is kind enough to let us keep the profits from our walking tours at the Fox, and that's a wonderful source of funding for us. Fulton County gives us some money for our educational programs. It's a small part of what we need to put those on, but they do help with it. We have numerous foundations who help us, and so we're just very lucky to be supported by a broad range of people within the community.
What type of things do you preserve?
Well, it surprises people. Many people today have all sorts of misconceptions about the National Register and what is historic or what is legally defined as historic. And if you go by age alone, I'm historic. I don't qualify because I'm not a building, but if you're dealing with a building or a property that is over 50 years old, it may qualify for the National Register of Historic Places. And so there are things now in Atlanta that people my age are really quite astonished that are considered as historic, with some of which would be a ranch house neighborhood, could well qualify as an historic neighborhood. Then we ourselves own what is one of the oldest buildings in Atlanta, the 3 antebellum buildings left within the city. We own one of them, the 1857 Grant Mansion. which is partly ruined. We're in the process of putting that back. It will take at least my lifetime, but it'll eventually be done. And that, I think, is what many people would think of more as an historic building, but there's this broad range of things, and then it may not even have to do with the age of a building. We've recently been involved with Pascal's Restaurant, and the efforts to save that. Pascal's is not yet 50 years old, but in terms of its importance as an historic site, of course, it's very important. And so there are all sorts of ways of judging these things. And what we're advocating is trying to save the best of Atlanta's past so that we can have a rich present and a rich future.
The Pascal's Restaurant, why is that historically significant? And where is it located, if you would tell us, please?
It's on Martin Luther King, down near several of the historically black colleges and universities. And it was a meeting place, a black-owned meeting place for many of the civil rights leaders in planning that movement. And so much of the planning sessions, much of the strategizing, much of the socializing that went on happened in this building. And it's part of a whole complex. It's not only the restaurant, but there's also a hotel that's attached to it. And then there was a nightclub. And so in terms of culture, it's rather important. As I said, it was black-owned. It's a remarkable place for the time in which it existed, and we thought it was well worth trying to save that. There's so many times when history comes alive and is more evocative and more meaningful if you can have an article or an icon through which to interpret that history, through which to bring it alive. And photographs don't really do it. They help us, of course, but being in the actual atmosphere, having a sense of the proportions and the texture and the scale and the light quality, all the things that are part of the built environment, I think give you a much richer experience of history.
So preservation is not so much about an old building, it's also about the cultural significance or the place.
Absolutely. There's really, that's another, I think, one of the great misconceptions, that we seek to preserve an artifact in isolation. One of the things that we try to do is to preserve the context of that artifact, so that if it's a building and it's within an historic neighborhood, that tells you more than if it's out of its context. So that, say you have an historic building that's very significant and someone wants to build on the property, the last step you would take in trying to preserve it would be to move it. What you would want to do would be to preserve it on the site with as much of its original context as possible, because then it speaks more truly.
Atlanta has always been a city that's been, the perspective is, the general consensus is Atlanta's been a city that has not been real concerned about its past and has not preserved its past. Is that an accurate?
I think it really is. Atlanta, in my experience, is unique within our state. I believe it's our chief economic engine. And it was really founded for reasons other than many of the other cities in the state, and it's been fairly true to its original ethos in that it's a place of commerce. It's a place where I think probably most of us are here because it offers us economic opportunities. And there's a whole series of reasoning I can go into of how that plays out to the current climate that we have and the attitudes towards preservation and towards the built environment. I don't know how far you want to go with that.
Was the attitude changing at this point? Has it come a long way from the past where things have just disregarded or torn down? Is it starting to change?
I think it is. I don't think that there's an acceptance yet generally that preservation can play an important part in economics and can make a city more attractive. Other cities have found that. Atlanta hasn't really espoused that particular lesson yet, although that's one reason we're so pleased with what's been done at the Fox, in that, as I said, we run these historic walking tours. We have some idea of what people want to see when they come to the city, and they do want to see part of the city's past. And it can be something that actually does fuel the economic benefit of the city. I don't know that Atlanta has that in mind yet because, in my opinion, oftentimes development is done more in terms of the view of personal profit and profit for a small group than it is with the view of how it fits into a larger economic benefit. And so one of the things that we try to do, in addition to the specific preservation issues that we take up, is to create a climate of understanding and appreciation for preservation and what preservation can do.
How does the Atlanta Preservation Center decide which sites to target for preserving?
Well, contrary to what the people who don't seem to wish for preservation in Atlanta seem to feel about us, we don't go out and try to save every single thing that is, say, over 50 years old. We can't because we have very limited resources. And when we do speak or make an advocacy issue over something, it's because we consider it important, either as representative of a whole group of issues or very important in and of itself, such as Pascal's Restaurant or the current controversy over the Martin Luther King Historic District. And those things we see as a very high level of danger and very important issues. Now, we do try to help people with their own individual concerns, and we try to give them information and point them in the right direction or give them advice about things. But we can't, because of the scope of what we are able to offer, we can't take up the cause every time there's an issue.
What is the current controversy in the Martin Luther King District that you mentioned?
There's a new economic incentive within the city called a TAD, and there was recently an article in the newspaper that David Penderett wrote, which I think explains it infinitely better than I could do secondhand, so I will refer people to that. But it has something to do with the sales taxes and rolling them back in to create development potential within underdeveloped areas. And that is to be used, as I understand it, to do a new development within the Martin Luther King District. Our concern about this is that it's our understanding that the developers plan to take down or radically alter a number of buildings within the historic district. On this particular block, about half the block is completely open, and then the other has, I believe, 5 historic buildings which are contributive to the Martin Luther King District. And this is where we're trying to do our job, which is to point out that these are valuable assets and that there would be a way to do this which would not endanger those assets and which would incorporate them.
Could you talk a little bit more about some of the obstacles the Atlanta Preservation Center encounters when trying to preserve sites and places?
Well, I think our main obstacle is when people refuse to enter into dialogue with us. Generally, what we want is to help them to get what they're working towards, but what we are hoping for is that they will moderate their approach in a way which will also ensure the future of the valuable preservation issues that we think are involved within their project. And so I would say some of our greatest problems come when we are excluded from the planning of these things. Say you have an historic district and you plan for 2 years and you never consult anyone who is concerned with preservation, and then in the last moment the preservationists are allowed to make a point, and then the answer is, well, it's too late. And if we're brought in early on in the process and can help people in terms of their planning and their understanding of what the assets are within the areas that they're choosing to develop or alter, I think it would be a much more beneficial situation. Likewise, even later on in the process, when we can't have a dialogue with people and actually discuss the issues when the point has already been decided, that puts us at an extreme disadvantage because that's what we do.
Well, are there other groups in the city that you work with to help preserve places?
Yes, their numbers are, I would say one of our greatest allies is the Urban Design Commission and their very, very fine staff down at City Hall. Karen Hubner and her group are just some of the most wonderful people I've ever had the privilege to work with, and I think I can say without fear of any serious contradiction that much of Atlanta's good quality of life is due to their stewardship and their dedication. And then we have a little festival that we do every year in early March called Phoenix Flies, which celebrates the idea of preservation within Atlanta. We have 20 preservation partners, people and organizations who are stewards of various historic sites around Atlanta, things that people may not think of as preservation, but which may in fact be part of their daily lives, such as the Academy of Medicine, the Wren's Nest, the Cyclorama, Margaret Mitchell House, Rhodes Hall, Callanwold. There are just numbers and numbers of things. The Parks Conservancy, Piedmont Park Conservancy, and Grant Park Conservancy. So there are all sorts of friends that we have within the community with whom we try to work together. And I think the preservation community has been very good about seeing that we all have a common cause, and we may approach it in different ways, but we're working towards the same goal.
What is the role of the Atlanta Urban Design Commission in preservation?
Well, in areas such as historic districts, when there's been what's called a local overlay, where the districts have written their own standards by which the district should be administered. Say you want to change a building within the Grant Park neighborhood. The neighborhood has gotten together, not the city, but the neighborhood itself has come up with standards which they consider protect the various facets of their built environment which create the particular character of Grant Park. So say you wanted to go in and build a huge modernist building and cover it with reflective stainless steel. This probably would not be in the character of historic Grant Park, and it would be up to the Urban Design Commission to decide whether that is allowable or not. And so they would make the decision as to what would be permissible within those districts. Likewise, there are certain things that are landmarked in Atlanta, and the Urban Design Commission has a review of those things to see about maintenance and alteration and addition and what can go on to protect the character of those buildings and places.
Does the Urban Design Commission have any enforcement powers?
They do. It's somewhat problematic, and our Historic Neighborhoods Coalition is in the process of meeting with Commissioner Graves, the Commissioner of the Bureau of Buildings, over just that issue and the issues of enforcement of the standards that are in place and are the law.
We're joined by Boyd Coons, Executive Director of the Atlanta Preservation Center. We're taking phone calls. Our number here is 404-873-1349. Boyd, could you give us 2 examples of successful preservation efforts that your group has been involved in?
Well, I believe, this is premature, but I believe Pascal's Restaurant is one of those. We don't have the assets, of course, other than with our own building at the Grant Mansion, to attempt to do hands-on preservation. However, what we do is education and advocacy. And Pascal's was an instance where there was not much attention being paid to this, and it could easily have been lost. And we chose to make an advocacy issue of it, and it had something to do with I think it aided the community's fight to save the restaurant. As I understand it, they've had wonderful success since then. Then, let's say what else. I believe we were involved in the Biltmore. I believe we were involved in Fairleigh Poplar was one of our earliest projects. I believe that would have been probably the earliest one. And that's one of the neighborhoods in which we do an historic walking tour. Recently, we went back I think it's about a year and a half ago, the federal court, which is in the old post office building there, wanted to do an expansion that would have endangered about half a block of fairly popular historic district, which, as you know, if any of you have been there, has a very delicate scale.
Fairly popular is in the center of downtown.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of bounded by Georgia State and Centennial Olympic Park. And it's some of our earliest commercial buildings which remain, and the streets have a wonderful small scale that the buildings, the historic buildings, lend to that quality, and the materials that are used and the ornamental textures and all that are there are really quite wonderful and unique within the city, within that area. And that was one of the early things that Preservation Center was interested in doing, was the creation of that district.
Okay. We have a phone call. Good evening. You're on People in Politics.
Yes, I'd like to know, Mr. Coons, have he studied the Sunset Avenue where the Martin Luther King Jr. lived? And they was talking about making Sunset historic neighborhood, a street. Have you done anything about that?
Sunset Avenue?
I'm not sure I am familiar with that.
Where Martin Luther King lived.
Are you Martin Luther King Sr. or Jr.?
A senior.
Senior.
No, I'm not familiar with that. In the historic district, I believe his boyhood home is preserved. This is not what you're speaking of, I gather.
Caller, are you still there?
Yeah,
You're not talking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s boyhood home, correct?
that's right.
Where is Sunset Avenue located? Could you tell us what part of the city that is
It
in?
runs off of Martin Luther King Drive, Sunset Avenue.
Now, is this the house that Mrs. King lived in until recently?
That's right.
Uh-huh. I have heard something about that, but I don't know specifically. I would say that it may be something that the Park Service is interested in, but I have no knowledge of that at this point.
Okay, I thought the Vine City Civic Association was talking about preserving that street for historic, a lot of history on that street. The old neighborhood, and most of the houses on that street is over 50 years old.
Well, it would be a wonderful thing to do, and we'd certainly like to help you all with it if there's anything we can do for you.
How would you help us with it?
We could show you examples of what other neighborhoods have done, how they've created historic districts, and the types of parameters that we could put you in touch with resources such as the State Office of Historic Preservation.
Okay, well, who has to see the urban design?
I'm sorry.
Yes, about the Urban Design Commission. I believe your best bet, caller, if I'm not mistaken, would be to contact either Atlanta Preservation Center, where Boyd is Executive Director, or the State Historic Preservation Office. Either one of those two would be a great lead for you to find out more information about that.
And since it would be an African-American resource, you might talk to Jeannie Syriac, who heads that up at the state office.
All right, thank you.
Caller, may I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
How do you feel about historic preservation? Do you think it's important?
I think it's important. We have a lot of history in this particular neighborhood, and the A.F. Harnan home, and we have doctors and a man that built a house about 2 doors down. He was the first black insurance man in Atlanta, and that's why we want to make this a historic street.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your call. Boyd, could you give us an example of a loss that you've had in historic preservation?
Yes. It's really one of the ways that I got into helping with the Preservation Center was over what's one of our really, really important resources in Atlanta, which is the Peters House that many people know as the Mansion Restaurant. It's on Piedmont, Ponce de Leon, Myrtle, and North Avenues, and it's the sort of the mother house for Midtown. It was the original house on the Peters estate. And I believe it was been 4 years ago, we were very interested in, as I was talking earlier about context, that not only the house be preserved, but also the landscape and the subsidiary building, which was a wonderful, the derelict carriage house. And for that period in Atlanta, there's almost, well, there really is nothing left now that reflects not only the great house and its landscape context, but also the service areas and what would have made the building run. And so we were very, very concerned that the carriage house be preserved. And the Urban Design Commission upheld that, said that it was quite important. And then the case was taken to court, and in the process of that, Fulton County Superior Court overturned part of the Atlanta landmark law, which was quite unfortunate in that it was seen to endanger landmark laws all over the United States. Even the National Trust was involved in this. They thought it was so important and so unusual that this action would be taken, and we considered that a devastating loss when during the interim between the time when the court overturned this and the law was rewritten and put back into force, that the building was bulldozed.
We're joined by Boyd Lewis, Executive Director of Atlanta Preservation Center. We have time for one more phone call. Our number here is 404-873-1349. What type of relationship do you have with the State Historic Preservation Office?
Well, I hope we have a very good one. They help us in many, many ways, and of course they are responsible for administering the process that by which a building becomes eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So you begin at the state office, and then it goes through them and makes it to the federal level. And it's that criterion, either eligibility for the National Register or actually being on the National Register, that helps us in terms of judging so many things, the value of so many things. There's a standard criteria, and there's a criteria for treating those things called the Secretary's Standards for historic buildings, which tell you how you may alter, how you may change, what you can do to an historic building and still have it retain its integrity. So the state does many, many things, including administer many of the tax programs that give some economic benefit to those who choose to participate in preservation. Then we have another entity with whom we're associated called Easements Atlanta, and we own 40 easements on historic buildings in the city of Atlanta. This is the highest degree of protection a building can enjoy in Atlanta because we actually own the outside of the building, and there's a considerable income tax credit that can accrue from that process. And again, one of the criteria for being eligible for that is eligibility on the National Register.
We'd like to thank Boyd Lewis, Executive Director of Atlanta Urban Design Commission, for joining us tonight. This has been People in Politics. Good night.